Okay, this is the Apex topic lecture for India, Boston 2018. Topic is the European Union should join China's Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of material to go through here, so I'll go through it quickly, but you have the whole slide in the videotape, so that should make it easier for you to go back and review different things that I'm talking about in the lecture. First of all, obviously the EU, 28 nations, does seem to be important that some of them are more significant. 22 make up the EU single market. It was created in 1958 under a different name and moved to the larger EU in 1993. These last three bullets have more importance. These are the governing bodies of the EU, the European Parliament, 751 members that are elected by the citizens of the EU, the European Council, head of states of the nations, and the Council of European Union, which are ministers from each nation in separate areas. There's no fixed membership. There's 10 different areas, and depending upon what project they're working on, each country could send different ministers or choose not to send a minister to that meeting. China does seem to think that the European Parliament is important because they feel like that the European Parliament should sign off on the BRI. They were very interested in the elections that occurred this last spring. So considering what join means, you might have to look and see which of these organizations or which of these bodies is the one that actually determines or makes a statement that says we support the BRI, assuming that we're talking about a block signature. Current status of the EU. Economy slower than it was in 2018. There's some improvement in the early 2019. You can find some evidence there. It's still a little unstable. Brexit threatened its stability. It's actually leading to other potential things like Italy exit. That actually is a relevant argument to this topic. And there's obviously a lot of political turmoil, increased nationalism, and lack of respect for human rights. A lot going on in the current status of the EU, so a lot of those things impact how you're going to argue things. I heard one team argue that when they were pressing on human rights, that France doesn't support human rights, so they won't pressure China anymore. So all of those current events types of issues are going to relate to your current arguments on this topic. A little bit of history on the BRI. It was announced at a 2013 ASEAN Summit. That's where she first announced it. Was announced really as a response to the U.S.-Asian pivot. So our Asian pivot from the Middle East towards that region of the world, particularly military, they felt like this was a response, which is interesting that that was the response. It was more of an economic response and an influence response than to a military kind of pivot. Different names. We will probably use the BRI or the Belt and Road Initiative. At one point it was the OBOR, which was one belt and one road, but they felt like that it's actually much more than one belt and one road, so they renamed it. Some people call it the New Silk Road in reference to history. But the two main parts are the Silk Road Economic Belt, that is the land portion of this project, and the Maritime Silk Road, which is the water portion. And a lot of times in your literature and in the debates we've been hearing so far, the water portion doesn't actually get as much attention, but it is equally part of the BRI. In particular, it's related to some of the things they're doing in Africa with all the ports. Deals with a lot of different infrastructure, railways, energy pipelines, highways, ports, even technology. We heard a lot about the ports issues in Africa. It wants to establish over 50 special economic zones, and so I don't know if you've investigated that very much. And it's saying that probably by 2027 it should involve about $1.3 trillion. I think names, organizations, and meetings are going to be important in your research. Obviously, on the left-hand side, we have Xi, who was the leader since March of 2013. But I think you should investigate other people. So I've seen evidence from Ma Jun, who's the chairman of the Green Finance Committee of China, Society for Financial and Banking, as like saying that the BRI is very green. And then I realized later that this is actually organization that works for China. So I think you need to go deep on these things and check the qualifications. And also going deep, I think you can talk about, for example, what the leadership looks like, what are his motives, and what is he thinking, which could impact some of the arguments. Organizations. I've always believed anytime you debate China, you should do some research on the People's Liberation Army. And are they more powerful than the civilian leadership? What kind of control do they have? And what kind of motivations do they have? I think that's important. That can impact some of your arguments. Uh, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is just one of the loaning groups, but understanding what that group does. And then it's interesting, this University Alliance of the Silk Road, there's a lot of research out there that sounds like it's from universities, when in essence, it was actually a university group put together by the Chinese government. Again, Ma Jun is one of those examples. That could potentially be a little biased, obviously, because it's state-run or state dominated, I guess. And in this case, I think it would be considered a bias, probably because there's not a lot of choice in what kind of material is produced. They have to support the BRI. Lastly, I think meetings are important. Like always, anytime there's a meeting about something about the BRI or something close to it, you'll find that there's good perceptual evidence material and things like that. The second BRF Rail Forum, the Belt and Road Forum in 2017, actually led to this concept, and also in April 2019, it came up, the debt sustainable framework. So this is being used by the pros in a lot of instances to say the debt traps are not really true. What's interesting about that, and this is maybe probably deserves to be more on the economic slide on the debt stuff, but the debt sustainable framework that people are using on the Pro is not really new. It's an IMF thing that's been around for a while, so probably involves austerity. And also, if you read the actual text of it, it's a recommendation. It's not actually mandated, so I don't know that it's going to solve the debt traps like the Pro teams are actually claiming. All right. Let's look at the geography of some of these kinds of things and get a little bit of an image. I always think it's really important to know where these things are going and how they relate. So these are the first two roads, the red one being the Silk Road Economic Belt, or the land part of it. You see that it actually goes through, it's going to go through probably, kind of skirts Russia a little bit, goes through Istanbul, and there are different versions of this, although it goes through Tehran, which is interesting. And then the blue line is the Maritime Silk Road. And you'll notice how it goes down and jumps and kind of circles some of these areas like Nairobi and Colombo, because that impacts the Indian Ocean, and some of the Indian Indian government people are feeling a little bit uncomfortable about this because of where those lines go. If you start to add rails onto this, you see the two ones that we saw on the previous map, but you also see some rails which are going straight through Moscow and then over to London and Madrid. So it actually adds more, which is one of the reasons why it's no longer one belt, one road, is because there's just a lot of projects going on with this. This is something that Christian Vasquez discovered, is there is a polar silk road. This is basically, and you'll see it goes around Russia, and it also goes in the little mini map on the, let's see if I can use my cursor here, down here on the right-hand side. It also shows how it's going to kind of go up against Canada and Alaska and those kinds of things. This is China funding Russia to do some oil exploration and drilling, and we heard a contention on this about how they would fund Russia. Russia would then militarize the Arctic in their search for oil. Actually, an interesting argument, considering last year when we heard one-off mining, the big answer was that Russia didn't have enough money. But if China gives them the money, then maybe this scenario becomes true. So this is actually called, it's like a spur of the railroad. It's called the Polar Silk Road is what's referred to, and that's a search term you can actually maybe do a little bit of research on. The last map is African routes. So this gives you, again, some of the routes up top, and this has a little smaller map to see, but you see some of the railroads that are existing, and some of them are under construction. And then you also see a little bit about the light green is where the ports are at, and so you see that ports are very important to this. That's the Maritime Silk Road part of it. And then you'll also see that there's what's going on in Africa down here in the bottom. Right, so you see that they're building some railroads. They certainly have ports and a gas pipeline. That's the yellow line that's showing up. Another gas pipeline that's being talked about, right, is going through this area, which, it's hard to believe they would actually get one through here. And then it shows that it's even getting on this side of Africa a little bit, mostly in some rail projects, but also a port here and several ports along the way. So the port system is fairly significant, and it's actually a very big part of this project. All right, so let's talk about the existing projects in Africa. Most people know about some of the things that are going on in Africa. It seems to be where it got most of the publicity of where it's starting. It was part of the Maritime Silk Road. That's why we're looking at ports and those kinds of things. Currently, 20 of the 65 BRI nations, nations that have BRI projects, are in Africa, so it's significant there. There are 50 Chinese state companies, 1,700 projects worth about 900 billion currently going on in Africa. Again, I think to some extent it's interesting to know about that, because while some of that you would say is not unique, like you can't affect it because it's already going on, what happens in these rounds where the Khan says, hey, we grant that the BRI would die with the lack of funding and the BRI is bad, what happens to these states that have these projects going? May be a problem. It's more about deep water ports. You would think initially that it's all about railroads and things like that, but in Africa, it really is about ports. Here's a fact that I found interesting. Every port that they have established or worked on has followed by PLA, People's Liberation Army naval deployments. So they're clearly using it for the military purposes and bringing in the military every port that they work on. This also is a large impact in the China rivalry with India. If you noticed how those ports kind of encircle the Indian Ocean in the earlier maps. So India has a lot of feelings about how this is going. I think they feel a little bit encircled. And then this is another interesting fact I thought was different, is the PLA is actually helping out with the pirate problems. So they're actually there doing a lot with their Navy that's helping out, or at least trying to help out with the pilot projects. Put a tip on the right-hand side, and that's this issue of what do you do? What happens if BRI projects die to these projects? And then, so if you're trying to figure out how to get impact, and then are there more nations in Africa that BRI could expand to? There were a lot of arguments about if you join it, you legitimize it, and then possibly more of these show up. And I'm curious to know if there are more African countries that could be expansion points for the Chinese to move into. All right, so let's look at existing projects in Europe. This was a little bit up in the air in San Jose. It started out with like, oh, there's like a few of them that joined, and then it was like half of them had joined. I think that's a little up in the air, and I'll try to explain why that's up in the air. Italy was the first G7 nation to sign a memorandum of understanding to join the BRI. This was recent. This was 2019, right? So this was a biggie because Europe started to say, whoa, this is a fairly big country, even though some of the other countries have dealt with China before and possibly even signed a BRI agreement. This was a big one. In that meeting where the Chinese leader went to Italy, they signed 29 deals worth about 2.9 billion, so some pretty big projects. Another reason that Italy is key is because it's an important NATO state. So there's some evidence that indicates that particularly the United States is not happy about this because they feel like Italy's important to NATO. Shortly after this visit, France reacted and the EU reacted and said, look, they really want to join as a bloc if they're going to do this, which is where you're getting all the evidence that talks about on the con about leverage, about how, oh, we want to join as a bloc. It was really more of an offhanded comment from the French leader, but that's where some of that evidence is coming from. Now, here's where the controversy exists about, are there half of the countries in the EU already BRI members? From what I'm reading is they are not. But for a long time, there's been Central and Eastern European countries working with China on economic forum. There was actually this thing called the CEEC. It was often referred to as the 16 plus 1. 16 plus 1 started in 2011, and then it added Greece and became the 17 plus 1 in 2000. Ooh, I don't know. I don't have that down. I think it was like 2017, 2018. I'm not really sure. But so is that joining the BRI? Right? When people say half the nations joined, well, is it just because they've been working with it all along? I've also seen data in this last bullet that says other BRI European nations are Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, and Greece, and Portugal, obviously in addition to Italy, which is the one we know signed to MOU. So I don't know if it's worth looking into seeing, okay, is there a difference between, kind of working with them on projects before? Is there anything different to just like working with the BRI? I mean, working with China economically is working with China economically. Why is this so different? Comment on the side, on the tip, be specific about your examples, right? So consider talking and researching the specific links and impact of a particular nation like Italy. Saw a team do a pretty good job having an economic impact about European unity and economic, where they said that if we didn't join, Italy would feel like on the edge and they would have to choose to exit Brexit. And so they had a whole different scenario as that even if they lost, the idea that it was good economically, like the BRI projects are good economically, they could still win this argument that Italy would exit, and that would kind of crush the European Union. And so they had some flexibility there. So going deep on the countries and having specific scenarios, I think is a good idea. All right. EU obviously has plenty of concerns. This actually slide in this picture really did a nice job of explaining some of the things that we're debating, right? And so this is the report that kind of came out after, I believe it came out a little bit after the Italy decision. So the BRI runs counter to the agenda of liberalizing trade. So arguably free trade, this isn't necessarily free trade. This is kind of locking in with one group. They believe it pushes the balance of power in favor of the subsidized Chinese companies. They don't think that's right. They clearly think there's a motive there. China wants to shape globalization to suit its own interests. There's clearly motives there. They warn European folks they might not get good contracts if China was not compelled to European principles of transparency, environmental standards, and social standards. Clearly, that's one of the things that the cons are arguing is coming through concessions, and that's why we shouldn't sign. So whether or not those standards are there, and kind of what do those standards mean, right? They seem like empty promises. Like, what does transparency mean? That's all important stuff to look at. Right-hand column, EU should not refuse to cooperate. That's what the officials said. The continent should state its own terms. So this is this bloc or unity idea. And that there's a lot of evidence out there that's quoted that says China's trying to divide and conquer strategy is what's in the evidence to break up Europe. And so the pros will say, we need to oppose that. We need to join as a unit so they can't divide and conquer. A couple comments there about Italy. That's a whole different area that China, the CPAC corridor that we saw some of in April is clearly infected by the BRI, and India is not particularly happy with the BRI and doesn't want people to join. And so that's a whole different area of what this topic's dealing with. Recent project updates. I think you should be watching for breaking news. Some of this stuff is real recent, and I don't think we realize that, and we should research it to see what it's talking about. First of all, Italy. Italy, that memorandum of understanding, that was just in March of 2019. So that was not very long ago when they actually signed it. So there is potential for a lot of uniqueness issues. China then followed up with a summit about the BRI in April of 2019, which was very recent. That's where he made a commitment to the Sustainable Debt Framework, I think it's called, Sustainable Debt Framework, which a lot of the arguments on the con is saying, oh, well, now they've committed to actually not doing debt traps. It really remains to be seen if they're going to give good debt projects in the future, but clearly the cons are arguing that that shows a concession, and so we should wait and not join to a bloc. Third bullet's interesting. One of the things you're hearing in a lot of debates is that China took advantage of Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka couldn't pay back their debt, and so Sri Lanka had to sign over the port to China, and so China owns the port. I don't really believe that's true from what my research has done. They may have signed maybe some shares over to them, but in May of 2019, Sri Lanka has been upset. They're actually making a new deal with India and Japan to add on to that port. So clearly, the evidence indicates that Sri Lanka still owns this port. They have not lost the port. It's not a big sovereignty issue, and so that's worth looking into. But that's very recent. In July of 2019, some new stuff. The African Continental Free Trade Bloc got together. I'm not sure if that's the equivalent of the European Union kind of saying, hey, we're going to deal with the BRI as a group. I would check into that because maybe that's an example of where a bloc has more effect because it appears that that's what Africa is trying to do is they're trying to say, okay, China, we will work with you in the BRI, but we're going to work as like a continental free trade group. And then finally, the leader of China is meeting with Turkey, so there's some indication that Turkey's going to also do some deals with China the BRI. But all this is like July of 2019. So I would watch out for breaking news because there's a lot of good stuff coming up and you need to keep on top of that. Okay, so what does join mean? What does join mean? Okay, so does that mean support? Does it mean participate? We had some discussions here. Does participate mean the pro has to defend money going from the European banks to China, right? So it's unclear. A lot of people get their links off the fact that the BRI can't survive unless they get money from the European banks, so China can actually have more money to invest because they're running out of money. So does it assume that if you vote pro, that they will defend that money going from European banks to China? I think 78% of people will say, yes, we'll defend that, but you may need to be ready to argue that that's what participate means. It means actually the money flowing, as opposed to does it just mean an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding? What are the implications of that? They're certainly not binding from what I've seen. And is that just a statement of like, hey, we think that if it works out, you should support the BRI? I don't know what that means. I would look for contextual definitions in the literature if that becomes an issue. So what does it mean when Italy joined the BRI? And so you just search for those kinds of things. And like, Italy joined the BRI or, Greece joined the BRI or whatever else. That may be a good way to look at contextual definitions. The Chinese, this goes back to this idea of what joining means. The Chinese think that the European Parliament elections, which were in May of 2019, are important because they seem to think that action would come from a governing body of the EU when they actually get some kind of statement or some kind of buy-in. They believe it should come from one of those governing bodies. How that impacts your arguments, I'm not really sure. Maybe that is bolstering the whole unity block argument that some people are making. That's a possibility. And then also remembering that the BRI is nothing more than a strategy by China. It is nothing formal. It is basically something that their leader, Xi, put into place. And he has a lot of power, and he's just like, hey, this is what my strategy is. I'm going to give it a name, and we're going to do that. It's not like anything like you sign on to. It's not like a treaty or something like that. And so that's why join becomes somewhat problematic, although it hasn't been coming up in debates. I'm just wondering if it might a little bit later in the topic, if this is what we debate. All right, so let's go through some of the areas. First, starting out with economics. Economics, lending from China. So this is the first thing. The projects are approved by policy lenders, is what they're called. And so even though there are banks and sources, like it says here, China Development Bank, Export-Import Bank, and all those, Silk Road Fund, the people making those decisions, those situations, have a name, and they're called policy lenders. That means they're responsive to presidential and geostrategic preferences. So they have to do what the president wants. And it is true, just by fact, that these loans are all kind of angled at some kind of a motivation. Okay, there's a funding gap for Chinese banks of up to $500 billion a year that they're coming up short, which is the whole reason why there are cards out there that says unless Europe supports it, it will not survive. I thought this was an odd question that came up actually in a debate today. So you'll get a pro getting up there and saying, hey, we should join the BRI because what will happen is that it'll help the EU because all this investment will happen in the EU. And in fact, one team was actually running a specific energy circuit type of transit area. And the question came up is, why does the EU give money to China's banks for then China to reinvest in the EU? Why would EU not just give money and loans to that EU location? Why does it cycle through China? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so we're kind of wondering, why that would be true. And I think that's at least a question that should be asked, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in some instances, that the EU would be better off just giving money directly to their own needs rather than sending it through some Chinese bank. That doesn't make sense. Second slide on economics. These are the arguments about the BRI being good for the economy. Obviously, you will all see the world famous, or kind of the famous World Bank card. It does everything. Like trade goes up, it saves 32 million. It's interesting wording. It says if it's completed, so I don't know if that means like the completion is like 2040 or what that means. But you're going to have to break down this card and think about it, because you're going to hear it like we heard it in every round that economics dealt with. A lot of teams are arguing that there's an EU recession coming, and if you sign with the BRI, it'll be good and it'll stop the recession. So, and of course, there are discussions over how fast that would happen, and whether or not it'll actually stop the recession. We're hearing less of these debates as the 2 weeks went on. Trade. The big argument here is that if you can do these rails and this kind of stuff, you'll get more trade and you get faster trade. One of the things I encourage my students to understand is that trade involves goods and services. Why is this important? Well, because most of the arguments that say that trade will be better for China or better for Europe assume different things. China is way ahead on goods. Obviously, they have cheaper products and they can make them cheaper, and so they send a lot of cheap goods over. So they're benefiting from trade goods. But Europe has a benefit in trade services. So the concept is if China needs something done, data crunched by some expert, then they would hire a firm that provides a service in China from Europe, right? So goods and services, I think you may be able to, like, if you're on the pro and trying to defend this, maybe you're like, hey, goods are not relevant, but there's a huge impact in services. There's all kinds of services that could be beneficial, and this BRI would open up more services. I'm not sure what those are, but I think it's important to understand the distinction between those. Typical reasons why it's good: creates infrastructure, that creates stimulus, jobs, and those kinds of things. And so that's helpful. Electricity. Electricity has a big impact on poverty, and so some of this evidence indicates that, why do you build dams and those kinds of things? Well, you build it for electricity, and that's what decreases poverty, right? Because if you have electricity. Also, renewable energy is a thing that people have been claiming on the economy. The last thing, some people are claiming this is free trade. I think that's questionable. There would be a lot of people that see this, categorized this kind of a block organization as not actually free trade, that free trade should just be open and not form these kinds of blocks. I think that's a question. Last slide on economics is BRI bad. Obvious thing we've been hearing all 2 weeks is debt traps. All right, these are the things where China goes in, says, hey, here's a deal, we'll make a dam for you, we'll help you work on your port, we'll build a railroad, and they have high interest rates, they have short repayment periods, and basically the country that took the loan is falling deeper and deeper into debt. Additionally, we're hearing that when they go in, they use Chinese workers, so there's not even any jobs created, and so the host country is kind of in trouble there. China takes advantage of them on trade of goods, right? So their goods can kind of come in there and swamp their prices, and so they'll actually always benefit on the trade of goods. So all these reasons are why basically none of this works. And then if they do go into default, or they get closer into further into debt, then the argument is they will have to put in austerity measures. And austerity measures means that they will have to cut social net spending like education and healthcare. And then clearly they're running some impacts on poverty and healthcare and education because of their in deep debt. And so that's where some of the impacts are coming on the con as well. One of the clarifications about this that I think is important to understand is that this is not the Marshall Plan, knowing your history. This actually, China expects a return, and the return is pretty high. And at least the people who are arguing against the BRI, China is clearly taking advantage of some of these countries. Last note, there's lots of empirical data about the risks and lots of speculation about more nations at risk. And so there's some good evidence that indicates that like 8 nations are already in deep trouble, and there's a possibility of 23 more, falling into these debt traps. And so that could be good evidence to look to in terms of like an impact magnifier when you want to talk about the significance of these issues. All right, let's switch to the environment. This is another key area of the topic. First slide is environmental. The BRI is good for the environment. Some pretty basic arguments. China's pushing green technology and renewables and things like that. Energy projects can eliminate traditional forms of cooking and heating. That's not healing, it should be heating. And that causes air pollution deaths, right? So when you typically use open fires, and those kinds of things, as opposed to electricity, then you get more air pollution, inside air pollution. Actually, I heard one team arguing, and that's bad for air pollution deaths. So those energy projects may solve that. Big argument. I don't really think you can quantify it much, but we get some teams pushing it hard, and that is rail services decrease fossil fuels. So over long distances, there are less plane flights and trade, and over short distances, you get kind of like a light rail thing where people are not driving their cars as much. And so there's a lot of evidence, and people are pushing this idea that the BRI is good because it decreases fossil fuel use by using rail services, and that's good for the environment. Probably true. I'm not sure what the significance of that is in terms of a schema of climate when they're actually claiming global climate. Not really sure, but there's clearly those arguments out there. There are lots of promises by Xi and Chinese banks to follow green investment principles, especially since April. They've come out hard, and so you're going to have a battle of evidence on this argument about them saying we're going to do all these wonderful things. Takes us to the next slide, which is, are they actually doing these wonderful things, or is the BRI bad for the environment? I think the evidence is better on this side. Clearly, there's some indication that when you need to be careful. When the other team's reading, China's doing all this good green stuff, a lot of the evidence indicates they're doing lots of good green stuff and renewable stuff inside of China, and what they're doing is sending out their old fossil fuel strategies to BRI projects, right? So these companies that are old companies in China are like, what are we going to do? Like, you're switching away. And they're like, oh, we'll find you some business. We'll send you to some African country or something like that. And you can use your coal and your oil producing strategies there. There's also some pretty good cards that indicates because of that, these countries are locking themselves into a fossil fuel kind of trajectory or model. And that will just continue to cause climate and global warming problems. Outside, a lot of people are talking about the air, but outside of that, there are some huge impacts on land destruction, right? I mean, if you go back and think about those maps, the amount of like rail they're going to put down, the amount of like they're going to dredge deep water ports, it's bad for the oceans. So like impacts of deforestation, soil erosion, species destruction. There's a lot of opportunities. I had one team that I suggested they're going to do this. Why don't you run like hurts the environment, talk about the water, or talk about the land and talk about the air, and so divide these things up so they're not all one area. But there's a lot of stuff that this is a huge kind of ripping up of the land to create a better economy. Last question here is what will happen if the BRI programs fold? I'm not really sure why it's actually here, but I think it's a question you need to ask yourselves is if all these programs just end, right? Because this is what the environmental bad teams will say is like, well, if we don't fund it, then they all just stop. Well, what does that mean? Does that country then not progress? Does that country kind of languish in poverty? Are they not allowed to have the right to industrialize? Will they industrialize with fossil fuels? Is it better to say, hey, at least there's a chance that the BRI does green energy, even if they're not, because the alternative is that that country is going to head down fossil fuels because it's cheaper? I think that's a question to ask a little bit when you're debating these kinds of cases. All right. Political stuff. Clearly some stuff that says there's political arguments say that BRI promotes repression and authoritarianism. China's exporting surveillance technology in the BRI nations into BRI countries on those projects, things like facial recognition technology and a lot of different kind of tech that would allow you to censor the internet, those kinds of things. There are pretty good cards on this is happening. Does that impact like an Arab Spring? I don't know. The second link they will run is that BRI nations are silenced about Chinese human rights violations because of debt. So they lock into an agreement, and then all this money, and so they're no longer willing to actually criticize China for what their human rights are doing. Also, there's arguments that say they needed the land for the BRI, so that's what promotes human rights abuses, they being China. So China said, hey, we need this land, so the Uyghurs, we're just going to like abuse the Uyghurs because we need their land. It rings true to what we've seen in the United States history with what they did with indigenous people when they went out west and tried to build railroads. Same kind of logic. Better teams will explain that while most teams will say the Uyghurs, that's not unique, you can't do anything, it's unfortunate you can't do anything. the better teams will say the Uyghurs are a model for what will happen in other BRA nations, right? So they'll look at like a Vietnam and they'll say, hey, there's another ethnic group here, and China's giving them the surveillance and the censorship technology and the repressive technology to really abuse that ethnic group. And they'll talk about China or they'll talk about Malaysia, and they'll say the BRI is giving them the ability to do what has been done to the Uyghurs. And so it's not that they can stop the Uyghurs, but the Uyghurs provide them an example, or the judge an example of how bad these human rights violations could get if these countries are capable. All right. Political slide number 2, joining is paused for human rights. Not as many people arguing this, but clearly we got some people doing this. Because, again, they want to argue the Uyghur argument, but the first argument is they'll say if the Europe joins as a bloc, it'll allow leverage over China's human rights actions. So, i.e., if I'm an investor, then I can attack them. A lot of this comes from this third bullet, which is the idea that the EU is going to issue a joint statement condemning Chinese human rights practices, and then Greece vetoed it, and they said nope. And the argument is because they were in debt and in a BRI project that they're not willing to criticize China, and so. The theory, according to this pro-argument, is if they join as a bloc, then Greece feels more comfortable joining into this declaration, which never got issued, and criticizing China's human rights activity. Now, that assumes that that EU statement has any impact, that it would actually change what China does, and I think that's relatively doubtful. The middle bullet is this idea about promoting economic growth can promote liberal forms of democracy and the rule of law. That's a possible turn against the Khan authoritarianism if you're going to claim that it increases economic growth. I wouldn't necessarily run that in the first speech if you don't want, but I would always have that available. So if you hit a Khan, you can argue that but the only way to really get political freedoms is through economic freedoms, and there's certainly a good deal of literature on that issue. All right, let's talk about the military for a little bit. Military promotes Chinese military power. How does that happen? Gives China access to strategic ports, for example, in Africa. We see that a bunch of those have gotten access. We also learned that once they get access to a port, they bring in PLA Navy deployments. It promotes expansion to a different area. So the Maritime Silk Road, which is the water route, clearly has some indication that they're going to have to continue to expand through the South China Sea into the East China Sea, and clearly those are going to cause problems. We know that from the UNCLOS topic, and so that's not a great thing. Also in Africa, like an example of Djibouti, right? Djibouti, they got a military base out of that. U.S. has got a military base. There are some teams arguing that's just going to cause a flashpoint. With the U.S. and China both having militaries in Djibouti in that area, that would be dangerous. Not completely convinced, but we definitely have heard that. And then finally, I think there is something to be said that the more they expand, that this is threatening India, and India is getting real nervous about that. That's particularly given that the BRI is supporting their naval buildup, the Chinese naval buildup. One of the things that he also committed to, the leader of China, was building aircraft carriers and a stronger navy. And so I think India is pretty nervous about that. So their expansion could cause conflicts with India. They're not happy. Second military slide. Here's some scenarios that we've seen that are possible. We talked about the Polar Silk Road. So this is the Polar Silk Road spur, kind of this other branch where China says, hey, we want some oil and some gas from the Arctics, and Russia, you're close, so here's some money, go up there and drill, baby drill. And then at that point, they also choose to militarize and protect their industries and their drilling activities, and that causes possibly a conflict in the United States. We know that from past experience that whenever you can talk about the Arctic and militarization, there are some reasonably dangerous scenarios that are occurring. A few teams are running this causes a NATO breakup, right? So Europe turns away to China. That makes them think, for a variety of reasons, NATO isn't necessary, or it makes the United States mad that they're moving away. That's why there was a lot of reaction by the United States on the part of Italy. They're very fearful that is Italy moving out of the United States sphere, not a NATO sphere, and into China. So that scares them a little bit. Decreased U.S. hegemony. Chad Meadows found a great card that just talks about how this is like a devastating blow if Europe joins. You know, the card at the bottom is a great rhetorical card, and I think the article has some pretty good warrants in it too. You know, throughout the article, and so it talks about U.S. hedge going down. So once you're into U.S. hedge, you know there's some impacts. And then finally, China feels a little bit more emboldened. You know, do they feel like now's the time they can push Taiwan? Do they feel like because of the Maritime Silk Road, they can now take their next step into the South China Sea? So these are all scenarios that could happen on the con, probably, if we join or if the EU joins the BIU. I had this slide in here, not really sure about all the areas. It's a newer area. Clearly, the Chinese feel that this is also a technology project. And so I think it's worth you investigating. The one thing that's come up is 5G. 5G is supposedly helpful in political repression, so that kind of shows up in the authoritarian cases. Other surveillance technologies like facial recognition and some other things, internet censoring techniques, that technology is showing up in the authoritarianism cases. The green energy technology is showing up in some of those cases, and there's probably a lot more out there. So I would take a look at the technology angles possibly of this topic as well. Okay, leverage. This is a huge topic. In fact, we were so tired of it here in San Jose, is that all we got to hear was leverage, 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 leverage. I don't think it's a particularly great argument, but I think you're going to hear it a lot, and so you need to be ready to debate. Why do I think it's a great argument? There's good arguments within leverage, but when you'll see at the end of these two slides, it is so messy that it is very hard to predict, and even against a good team, clearly win these arguments. So, leverage and reform the pro. So this is the pro saying they will increase leverage over China and over the BRI practices. First argument is unity or block leverage. This is the idea that if the EU acts as a block, they can get China to change their debt strategies and their debt traps and whatever else they're doing bad. Anytime you say China's doing X bad on the con, they will say, oh, but if we join as a group, we can get them to stop that bad practice. I'm not really sure, but they will make that argument. They'll say it stops the silencing if they join as a block and allows a unified voice to like tell China what needs to happen. So that's a common pro argument. EU investment leverage. This is the argument that if the EU gives them a bunch of money because they need investment capital, that will give them investment leverage to kind of tell China what they should and shouldn't do. That's a popular argument. Project leverage. This is an interesting argument that says the EU can give a bunch of money, right? But once they're involved, each individual project has to be approved. And so you don't lose leverage. You would still have leverage on every project. So if China wanted to do something in Greece or India, I'm sorry, Italy or whatever, in France, they could still look at that project and say, well, we don't know. We think you should like change it in this way or the other. Some examples exist. Malaysia was involved in a project and they were able to actually get China to reverse some things and change some things mid-project. So it's not like when a country goes into a BRI project that like China gets all the say. Obviously the host country gets some, and Malaysia is an example. Now, when you're arguing pro on this and the con is trying to argue it, I think you need to make three arguments. And this became pretty popular here. One, if the con's going to win leverage, it's a problem, right? And they need to make three things. One, if the con's going to win leverage, right, so this is the next slide, they need to prove that concessions are existing now. Because if concessions aren't existing in the status quo when we're trying to do leverage before we join, then it proves it doesn't work. They'll have some evidence indicate some concessions are occurring. It's unclear what those concessions, if they're concessions or just like promises, but they'll have some of that. Second, the con needs to prove that there's an offensive reason to why joining the BRI decreases leverage. So if the con says that we have a lot of leverage now, and it's great, we're getting them to change things, and the pro says, but we would have more leverage if we joined, and the con can't come up with a reason why joining decreases leverage, then there's no reason not to do both. So they need offense, and they don't often have offense. And finally, third, there are some people that are arguing that this logic on the con, and I'm going to get to that slide in a second, about, well, we could pressure them now and then join later is somewhat unfair. Is joining still supporting the pro, right? How long are they going to wait to join? 5 years, a year, 20 years? And so is that actually still supporting the resolution? There are some people that are putting this framework out against a con that's trying to argue leverage and having some pretty success because it's hard to meet all three of these things. So con is also arguing, and we've seen some one-off cons that are just like leverage, what do they say? They're like, because they think they're being tricky. They're able to not argue that, like, they're able to argue the BRI is still okay, but they make it even better, right? And so they don't have to, like, too much pressure. But they put all of their eggs in this basket about leverage and how they're going to make it better, and that's problematic. So what are the leverage parts for the con? Investment leverage. So this is the idea that you can't have my investment until you change it, right? You want my money, then you need to set up the project the way I want the project set up, and then I will give you your money, which makes some amount of sense in investment, right? Why would you invest in something that you think is problematic? You would look at them and say, I will invest in you if you do X, Y, and Z. So that makes some amount of sense. Reform is better than project leverage. I think this is not a bad argument for the con. So the pro will say, hey, we can join and then we can change individual projects. But if the con says, yeah, but if we wait and hold out, then we change the whole structure, right? So it's not like we have to change every project. We change all of the way that China does their debt loaning or their debt traps and things like that, and their transparency, that we get like global reforms on what China's doing as opposed to having to fight for it in every little project. And so that's not a bad argument. They obviously say you can join later after concessions, and so they try to capture that pro-ground. It's important, as we said before, that if you're doing this in the con, you need to have some evidence that says concessions are occurring now. And I would press them on the pro, because we're getting to the point where some teams are like, yeah, they got concessions, and they'll rattle off 7 things they got concessions on, and there really isn't evidence on all those things. There's some very vague concessions which have been made very recently by China, and it's unclear if those are actually going to like bear fruit, as it were. And then there's the argument that China won't listen after they get investment money. They're going to be like, great, we got your money. Now we're going to run and do whatever we want to do. And so the leverage arguments are important. We actually did, in our lab, some leveraged debate tournament, like you do an impact tournament, because we thought it was important to really learn this stuff well and practice it. So I would drill in just this area quite a bit. All right. Going to move on to a few more things before we finish up. Bigger picture items. Here are some reasons why I'm putting this out here. Number one, they attack the assumptions of arguments, right? So the assumptions of arguments are attacked by looking at the bigger picture, and that can be important. Also, these are generic use items. You can use these types of arguments when you hit something new and you don't have any evidence on it. So these generics, they serve a generic purpose. Finally, they're great things to read. I know some of you loved, and I'll get to it in a minute, like what Chad Meadows did with offensive realism. So there's a lot of cool reading, but don't expect to skim these readings. These are not going to be like economist articles and like Washington Post articles. These are going to be some pretty heavy-duty reading, but I think have some value. So what are these things? All right. Well, first of all, there's United States relations. Not as deep as those kinds of things, but I think the tip there is that Trump's positions could impact the arguments on this topic. Here are some examples. There is a U.S., Japan, Australia BRI in the works. Some evidence says it's all 3 of them. Some of it says it's Japan and Australia. I even saw like a U.S., Canada, I don't know, Japan or Australia, one of the 2 type of things. So looking at what the United States, how they're trying to counter this economically is probably important. What the United States feels about NATO if the EU joins is clearly an important area, and what they would think about that. And then finally, any kind of U.S. backlash against what Europe does. If Europe joins, the United States gets all mad and says, well, kind of, screw you. That's not fair. And I've seen evidence that indicates that they would cut off their intelligence. So they would not cooperate with Europe on intelligence gathering, which has some terrorism impacts. And additionally, that they would backlash in terms of trade. They would say, fine, if you're going to cozy up to China, then we're going to include you in this trade backlash and trade war. And so that could be a problem. So United States relations are something you're going to have to look at a little bit. Chinese hegemony, right? That's a big issue. Basic question is more Chinese power good or bad? All I'm going to say about this is there are impacts galore, right? As to whether or not the rise of China is good, rise of China is bad. It was a whole topic at one point. So, you might be able to just be ready to say, hey, the assumption of the one side is China will get more power. Fine. I don't have anything on their case, but I can talk about why that's bad or that's good. I think you should go deep on the PLA or Xi's motives. when you're arguing these things, it gives you a little bit of what I call trump card sometimes, because when they're like saying, well, this is what'll happen, you're like, well, no, it actually won't happen because the PLA controls the situation, or Xi's motives are doing this. And so it allows you to give another undercutting reason why your warrants and your links are true, and those are not theirs are not necessarily as true. All right. International relations theory is another thing. What motivates states, right? This is a question that helps you predict actions and thus improves your link arguments. That's why this stuff is important. So what are some of them? And I'm not going to cover all of them, but I'm just going to list some of them and say these are interesting areas. Realism. I know that Chad did a lecture on offensive realism that everybody liked last year. And Nick Colburn-Palo is going to be there and talk about some of these things, as Chad will be back. Constructivism, liberalism, neoliberalism, like it's kind of a capitalism argument of feminism, all possible theories that talk about what motivates states and can help out your link arguments and get you in a debate where get you a step up in a debate where in some instances they're just reading counter evidence about the BRI would do this, the BRI would do that. You're like, well, no, I think the BRI would do this because this is the way China looks at the world. And you use some of these other cards to do that. So I think that's worth looking into to ground your arguments. Multipolar versus bipolar world. All right. I do want to point out that this is different than bilateral or multilateral. Those are usually trade agreements. Multipolar is about influence, and bilateral multilateral is about agreements. That seems to be something that could be an important issue. And that is sometimes more in the IR literature. A lot of the international relations professors write in their blogs about it, and they have arguments all the time about this. So that issue is, or is it unipolar, right? That would be more U.S. hegemony type thing. So, does military, economic, cultural, and technology strengths is there a situation where those change and we get something which is different? There are clearly some stuff that argues a multipolar world is good, and then there are clearly some authors who say that the unipolar or the typical bipolar world is much better, because there are too many poles. It just kind of creates chaos, and so on. So I think I would look into those kinds of things. To wrap up, these are just a few of the starting points. I'm sure I've missed some things that probably could be talked about, but hopefully this gives you an idea of things you need to look at, blocks you need to write, places you may go into cases. I do predict the topic from San Jose to Boston will balloon and expand fast. We dealt a lot with leverage and debt traps. We started to see a little bit more political oppression type cases, but I would say 80% of the cases were just about debt traps and whether or not it would improve trade or infrastructure and leverage. So I think we'll probably move beyond that a little bit in Boston, and I look forward to different arguments. Again, my argument on this, if you want to be successful, you've got to go deep in these arguments to be successful, is research, be the third or fourth extension ahead of that other debater. It also makes you look smart, basically, and all judges like that. They like a smart debater, and that will increase your speaker points and give you more success. We will see you in a few days in Boston.